Sometimes the reason people have such a hard time fixing the problems that they are experiencing in their marriage and in their families is because while they say they want help, they really aren't committed to certain fundamental convictions that are absolutely essential for change to take place. And in this series of videos, we've been looking at a number of those convictions. I want to give you two more essential convictions now. First of all, God knows better than I do about marriage. Second of all, there is something more important than my own personal happiness in marriage. Third of all, God allowed me to get married to the person I got married to for a reason. Fourth of all, I am the worst person I know. Let me read you something and see what you think. It was while rehearsing gospel truths in Romans that Paul was moved to speak of his struggle with sin and exclaim, "Oh, wretched man that I am." While reviewing God's abundant saving grace on another occasion, Paul was prompted to confess that he was the foremost sinner of all. Likewise, the deeper I go into the gospel, the more I comprehend and confess aloud the depths of my sinfulness. A gruesome death like the one that Christ endured for me would only be required for one who's exceedingly sinful and unable to appease a holy God. Consequently, whenever I consider the manner and necessity of his death, along with the love and selflessness behind it, I am laid bare and utterly exposed for the sinner I am. Which sounds painful, but is really good in some pretty significant ways. What happens when you're seeing yourself this way? As a sinner whose only hope is the death of Christ. First of all, it strips you of any reason for pride. If you look at the way God designed the gospel to work, he made it so that you have no reason to boast in yourself at all. Boasting in yourself and trusting in Jesus are opposites. You can't hold on to both at the same time. Paul says in Ephesians 2:8, "For by grace you've been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast." Which I know sometimes may seem hard to people, but it's actually an amazing gift from God, because you know what's at the root of so many problems? It's pride. Pride is at the root of so many problems in marriage, and the gospel is designed in such a way to strip us of any reason we have for being proud of ourselves. Or actually, it reveals that we have no reason to be proud of ourselves. I can't look at my wife and think, "Oh, she's a worse sinner than me." I don't trust myself. I have an instinct to think better of myself than is real. And so, because I understand the depth of my sin as revealed in the gospel, when we have problems, I need to consider whether or not I am a big part of that problem. It's not shocking if I am. And I'm not so bothered when I'm confronted because my wife can't say anything worse about me than Jesus already has. When I became a Christian, I confessed, I am so bad that I deserve hell. How can my wife say anything worse about me than that? One very specific thing understanding your sinfulness does is makes you realize that you need objectivity. You recognize how easy it is for you to see and believe your own point of view. You are pro-you. And so if you understand the gospel and what it says about you, you come to doubt your conclusions and you're willing to listen to someone else's perspective. But not only does the gospel strip us of pride, seeing ourselves this way gives us hope because we know salvation is all grace. We look at ourselves and we can either be deluded, I can do this, or we can be depressed, I can't do this. But when we think about our salvation, we realize God is at work in us and God is kind and he can help us to do things that we never could. We can change, but change isn't about how strong we are first, but it's about how strong God is. I was reading someone recently and he says, "After years of working with marriages, including my own, I've come to a conclusion. Marriages that struggle are often lacking one key ingredient. What do you think that ingredient is? It's something that when missing from any relationship will cause trouble in the relationship. The missing ingredient is called grace. And one reason marriages lack grace and families lack grace is because the people in them forget how dependent they are on God's grace. Thinking about your need for God's grace, you know what it should do in you? It should create a humility. It should create a dependent spirit. When a Christian husband and father looks at himself, he sees a person who desperately needs God's help if he's going to be the kind of spouse God wants him to be. And when a Christian wife and mother looks at herself, she sees the same. And knowing our need of God's help and understanding how much help we do receive every day should create a real atmosphere of grace in the family, because when a Christian husband and father looks at himself, he knows he's a person who's been forgiven much. And when a Christian wife looks at herself, she sees the same. And so if you are convinced that you're only accepted by God because of what Jesus has done, that you're a hell-deserving sinner whose only hope is grace, then you're going to have to show that kind of grace in your family, to your wife, to your husband, to your children. Now, what does that look like? One, you're not going to stand up on your little holy hill way above your spouse and your children and act as if obedience were always easy for you. You're not going to talk and act and think like you always get everything right the first time you do it. You're going to give people time to change. You're going to forgive easily the way God has forgiven you. Can I just say that maybe the reason some people are having problems in their marriage and in their families is because they say they believe what the Bible teaches about grace, but they really don't. If you're not prayerful, if you're not humble, if you're not easily correctable, if you're not suspicious of yourself, if you're not willing to forgive easily, you probably don't. I am the worst sinner I know. Final conviction. My relationship with my spouse and my relationship with God are connected. Sometimes people come for help and they'll be talking about the problems they have with their spouse, and I'll look at them and say, so what? So what if you have a terrible spouse? What difference does that make on the way you relate to them? Now, there's a sense in which that's a terrible question. What difference does it make on how I relate to them? It makes a big difference. It makes it harder. I need more help. I face more temptations. And of course, in certain cases, the Bible does acknowledge that there is a place even for divorce. But there's also a sense in which you can say it doesn't really make much difference at all. If you look at Ephesians 5, why does the wife submit to her husband as to Christ? If you look at the husband, why does the husband love his wife? He is to love her the way that Christ loved him. He does it unto Christ. And this is important. You relate to your spouse, your relationship with your spouse, the way you treat them ultimately reflects your attitude towards Christ. You're not just doing what you do because your spouse deserves it. You're doing what you do as a way of worshiping Jesus. The two are actually connected, and that's important for you to remember, because it's easy for us to want to separate our life into these little boxes. And in one box, we have our relationship with Christ, and when we think about that, we think about what we do at church and, singing the songs and reading our Bible. And then in another box, we have our relationship with our spouse and our family. And for some people, those two boxes never touch. They think they're great with God because they come to church, they talk, they sing, they read, and they act spiritual. But then they come home and they're terrible to their family. And they don't see any connection between the two. But the Bible has no time for that kind of thinking. It destroys those boxes. Your love for God is going to show up in your love for your wife. Your love for God is going to show up in your love for your husband. It has to. John puts it like this in 1 John 5:20. He says, if anyone says I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. By brother, John means fellow Christian, and so that applies to your husband or wife. If you say you love God and you hate your wife or husband, and by hate, John doesn't necessarily just mean you say that with your words. He's talking about the way you relate to them. If you say you love God, but the way you relate to your husband or wife is actually the way the Bible defines hate, then you're lying. Your attitude towards God shows up in your attitude towards your spouse. If Jesus is Lord of your life, he has to be Lord over you in your family. When we talk about family, we're talking about something that has to do with your relationship with Christ. This is a way you submit to Jesus' lordship in your life. And this motivation is important because when you look at the other person, you're going to have all kinds of reasons for excuses. That's why you have to make this connection with Jesus. It's not just about the other person and what they deserve. It's about you worshiping God by loving your neighbor when it's difficult and obeying God in your relationship when it's not comfortable. Do you believe God knows what's best for your family? Before we move on, do you believe God knows what's best for marriage? Do you believe there's something more important than even just you being comfortable for a little while? Do you believe God allowed you to marry your spouse for a good purpose? Are you convinced that you are a sinner who desperately needs God's grace? And do you believe that the way you treat your family in your home is actually connected back to what you believe about God? Before we move on, start there. Examine your commitments. If you're committed to those convictions, we have hope. We can change. If you're not, we can talk for a long time, but we're not really going to get anywhere.